Hello and welcome to resistance training. Today what we're going to be talking about the different things that you can do in a weight training environment using resistance training to help your clients achieve their exercise goals. Okay, the different forms of resistance that we have up here: gravity, body weight, external, as in externally added resistance, and environmental forms of resistance such as water and wind. Let's take the example of a little quarter squat, looking at gravity as a form of resistance. If I do a little quarter squat like so, as I'm coming back upwards in the movement, I am working directly against gravity, and gravity acts downwards, directly downwards on top of me as a form of resistance. Next form of resistance is body weight, and that form of resistance is the same as what was used in the squat example. So if we go back to the quarter squat and I do a little quarter squat movement, I am using body weight. That is, I'm having to be able to lift my body weight up against a resistance, and I'm also working directly against gravity as a form of resistance as well. Common body weight exercises includes things like chin-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, and freestanding squats. Next is external. Let's say, for the sake of illustration, that these whiteboard markers are dumbbells. Two forms of resistance that I hold in my hand. If I do the quarter squat example again, holding dumbbells, then I'm using the top three forms of resistance. Quarter squat down and up, I have to move my body weight, I'm working directly against gravity, and I've added external forms of resistance to my hands. And they're the three most common forms of resistance that you'll find in a weight training environment or a gym environment. The other two forms of resistance are environmental: water and wind. Water resistance is commonly used in aqua aerobics and also in rehabilitation settings when people have become injured and they want a low level form of resistance initially to increase their strength levels progressively. And wind is the last one. You may have seen athletes training where they're using parachutes to try and capture wind and use that as a form of resistance for their training programs and their athletic development. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit now about strength outcomes. What can be expected outcomes from a weight training environment? There are quite a few, but I'm just going to look at the main ones. Maximal strength, hypertrophy, and strength endurance. Now, maximal strength is maximal force that you can exert. So the maximal amount of strength or maximal amount of force that your muscle or muscle groups can force against a given resistance. Hypertrophy is also strength. It's also the ability to develop strength, but in the hypertrophy example, you develop strength through increasing the size of your muscles. And hypertrophy literally means increases in muscle mass. Now, you can actually develop your maximal strength without changing your body weight. However, you can only develop hypertrophy, that is, you can only develop strength via hypertrophy by increasing your body weight, because you need to increase the size of your muscles for this avenue. And strength endurance, not a commonly sought after goal in the fitness industry, but basically it's the quality that allows your muscles to work continuously without fatiguing. Before we move on, we'll look at the maximal strength and hypertrophy examples put into a context so that you understand the differences between the two. Because essentially they are strength development, they're just achieved via different means. Okay, in the maximal strength example, let's assume that this whiteboard marker is a glass of water. I want to take a drink, so what I do is I flex at the elbow and allow that glass to come to my lips so I can take a drink. Bicep muscle contracts, doing elbow flexion to ensure that happens. Now, what happens is there's these specialised cells within the muscle and within the muscle's tendon called proprioceptors that talk to the brain. And they send a message to the brain saying that I want to take a drink, I'm currently thirsty, and I need the biceps to flex so that I can take that drink. The brain will send a message back to the biceps. It will normally be compliant and say that's fine, but since it's only a small object that the biceps can easily maneuver, I'm only going to switch on about 20% of the muscle, because that's all that's needed for the muscles or for the biceps to take that drink. Let's say I then go into a gym training environment and I pick up some heavy dumbbells or some heavy barbells. again, using your imagination, these whiteboard markers have now turned from a glass of water into a pair of dumbbells. And I'm trying to lift maximally a bicep curl or a weight that I can do only once or twice. What happens in this example is the same sequence of events. The bicep muscle talks to the brain via the specialised cells called proprioceptors. This time, however, they're saying that I want to lift a much heavier weight than just a glass of water, and it's going to be a maximal effort, and for me to be successful, I need as much of the bicep recruited as possible. Now, if I'm lucky, the brain may switch on about 90% of the muscle fibres or the muscle tissue in the bicep. However, once it gets to a certain critical level, the brain will be concerned about any injury that could come to me, such as a muscle tear or a tendon being ruptured from the bone, and it will stop and deactivate that muscle so I cannot continue in the movement. In that example, as I'm lifting the barbell or as I'm lifting the two dumbbells, I'm fatiguing quite heavily. The brain's really concerned about damage to the body, so it will turn the muscle fibres off and won't allow me to recruit all of my muscle fibres, and therefore the weight will drop to the floor. That's an example of maximal strength. You can improve your maximal strength by exposing your body to heavy resistances, which we'll talk about soon, to develop the brain's ability to recruit more muscle fibres. So you don't really change the muscle mechanics, you don't change the size of the muscle. All you do through maximal strength training is increase your strength and allow the brain, by giving evidence to the brain that you're not going to hurt yourself, and eventually the brain will succumb to your demands and recruit more of the muscle fibres in your muscle, increasing their efficiency and therefore their ability to exert force. Hypertrophy, on the other hand, is completely different. It increases the size of the muscle. Okay, so what happens in a hypertrophy example, I want to lift a certain weight. If I can't, by continually training that muscle, it will become bigger. And bigger muscles are stronger muscles. There is a direct relationship between muscle size and muscle strength. That is, if I increase the size of my bicep muscle by 5%, I've increased the strength of that muscle by 5%. So increasing my muscle size or increasing my body weight through hypertrophy results in an increase of strength because there's more muscle fibres for me to use, or more muscle fibres for the brain to selectively turn on. And as mentioned, endurance, not often a common sought out requirement or outcome from training, but it is the ability of the body to use its muscles sub-maximally for an extended period of time. Okay, we're going to look at training variables in a resistance training environment. Repetition, sets, rest between sets and recovery are the common ones that's going to be employed, as mentioned, in a resistance training environment. Let's look at the application of these variables to the qualities that we can obtain in the gym environment. Okay. I'm going to abbreviate repetitions to reps. Okay, since we've been using the bicep curl example, we'll stick with it. Now, the term rep or repetition is one complete movement of an exercise. Again, using your imagination, this whiteboard marker is a dumbbell or a form of weight training equipment. I perform a bicep curl via elbow flexion from a fully extended position to a fully flexed position. That is one repetition. I have completed one repetition of bicep curls. 2 repetitions of bicep curls, 3, 4, and so on. As soon as I stop and have a rest, that constitutes a set of that exercise. So again, 1 repetition, 2 repetition, 3 reps, 4 reps, rest. I have completed one set of 4 repetitions. I then go back to that same exercise and do another 4 repetitions of that exercise, 3, 4. That is my second set of 4 repetitions, or my second lot of 4 reps. Rest is the rest between sets. So after you've completed the movement, after I've completed my 4 repetitions, 3, 4, sit down and have a rest. The amount of time before I undertake my next set is the rest between sets. And recovery is the recovery between training sessions of that same muscle group. So when I finish my weight training my weight training session, the next time I come back to the gym, or the next time I'm back in that weight training environment, doing bicep curls, the recovery is the amount of time between those 2 sessions training that same muscle. Now the variables for each of these are different for each of these qualities. So depending on what your client wants to achieve, whether it's maximal strength, increases in muscle size, muscle endurance, there will be different intermixes of reps, sets, rest and recovery to ensure your client achieves those goals. For maximal strength, one to 5 repetitions. That's what we call low repetition training, lifting very heavy resistances. And that makes sense because we want to convince the brain to recruit as much of the muscle as necessary, or as much of the muscle as possible. And we can only do that by giving the brain continual evidence that we can cope with heavy resistances. And if you recruit all the muscle fibre, then we're not going to hurt ourselves, and you can have faith that you can activate all our muscle fibres without risk of injury. Sets are 4 to 5, so we do 4 to 5 lots of this repetition range. Rest between sets is 4 to 5 minutes. Now that is quite a lot of rest between sets. That is maximal. So that means is after 4 to 5 minutes, you go back to perform your next set. You'll be completely recovered. Therefore, you should be able to lift exactly the same weight as before. Again, compiling evidence for the brain to show the brain that you can cope with these heavy resistances. And 48 hours or 2 days recovery between training sessions where you're going to train that same muscle group again. Hypertrophy, on the other hand, Hypertrophy, on the other hand, is 8 to 12 repetitions. So it's moderate to high repetitions, or moderate to high training volume, 3 to 4 sets, or 3 to 4 lots of 8 to 12 repetitions, 30 to 120 seconds rest between sets. So that's one of the key differences. We're doing more work as opposed to maximal strength, and our rest between sets is quite low, between half a minute to 2 full minutes. And what you'll find in a hypertrophy training environment where you're trying to increase your strength by increasing the size of your muscles is that by the time you undertake your next set, you're going to undertake that in a pre-fatigued state. Therefore, it's quite common in a hypertrophy training environment that you can't lift the same weight in consecutive efforts. You might actually have to drop it down a little bit because you're not adequately recovered from your last effort. And again, like recovery training, we're looking at about 48 hours of rest recovery between training sessions of that same muscle group. And endurance, as I've mentioned previously, not a common sought after goal by clients. It's the ability to use the muscle sub-maximally for extended periods of time. Often endurance clients will train in excess of 15 repetitions per set or higher, 2 to 3 sets per effort or higher. Rest between sets is minimal because they want to ensure that they're training their muscle in a fatigue state to develop its endurance qualities. And again, like all the other variables, or all the other qualities I should say, 48 hours rest, recovery between training sessions of that same muscle. Now what I'd like to do is they're the variables presented for you for each of these qualities, but I'd like to represent that on a continuum so you understand from a volume intensity perspective where each one of these fits. If we look at a volume continuum, high to low, and an intensity continuum, We'll flip it around and go low to high. We find that maximal strength training is very high intensity training, low volume. So therefore, maximum strength training would find that at this end of the continuum. Very high intensity, lifting heavy weights, but not doing much of it. Low reps and plenty of rest between efforts. Now, at the other end of the continuums is endurance training. Doing lots and lots of work, but the intensity of effort is not that high. So, for endurance-based training, we find that it is high volume and low intensity for endurance. Now, hypertrophy, a lot of people think it fits somewhere in the middle. Not actually the case. It's towards the high end of the spectrum for volume. So it sits about here. It's moderate to high in volume, and therefore, with the volume intensity relationship, it's low to moderate in terms of training intensity. So on the volume intensity continuums, this is where the qualities sit. High intensity, maximal strength, low volume. Low intensity, high volume for muscle endurance. Hypertrophy towards the high volume end and towards the low intensity end. Now before we move on to the next slide, a couple of points to identify with maximum strength training and hypertrophy training. There's not an exact training dose. There is an intermix from them. For example, if you're training exclusively between the 8 to 12 repetition range, you will get mostly hypertrophy benefits, but that's not to say that you won't improve your maximal strength or your strength endurance. A considerable degree of overlap exists between the qualities. And the final point in regards to that is maximal strength training or high intensity training is quite aggressive to the body and quite violent to the body. Therefore, beginners should not engage in maximal strength training. They should focus exclusively on the hypertrophy variables or the muscle endurance variables until they've developed a bit of training history, at least 2 to 3 months, before looking at applying some maximal strength training variables or training techniques. Okay, looking at some terminology in resistance training now. First point is compound and isolation. Compound or a compound exercise is a multi-joint exercise. That means there's more than one joint working at the same time. Isolation, on the other hand, is a single joint exercise. Only one joint and therefore only one muscle is working at that time. With our weight training, research has shown that compound exercises or compound movements where more than one joint is involved at the time is much better or much superior to strength development or the qualities that you want to achieve in a resistance training environment. Compound exercises have been shown to be more time efficient. Because you're training more than one muscle group at the time, you find that you can get through your training session a lot more quickly than if you did a lot of isolation exercises. Okay, let's look at compound versus isolation. Again, dumbbell example with the whiteboard marker, elbow flexion or bicep curls. That is an isolation or a single joint exercise. Only the elbow joint is working, only one muscle group is being exercised, which is the biceps muscle. If I change that to a rowing exercise, where I'm grabbing a bar in front of me and pulling my elbow backwards, that is a compound exercise. More than two joints are working at the same time, therefore more than two muscles are getting exercised. I'm doing what's called elbow extension, as the elbow is moving backwards, and I'm doing elbow flexion because the elbow is flexing at the elbow joint. Therefore, I'm training the latissimus dorsi through the extension of the shoulder, and I'm training the biceps through flexion of the elbow. Greater strength development has been shown with compound exercises, as mentioned, and they are more time efficient. Machine versus free. Different types of training equipment that you'll find in a gym environment. Some are machines that control the movement for you. Some are free weights, such as dumbbells and barbells. That is, you have to control the movement and you have to exert the force against them. Now, similar improvements in strength development have been noted irrespective of which mode you use. However, For a beginner or for a novice, particularly in the first 4 to 6 weeks of training, it's recommended that they use almost exclusively machine weights, if not exclusively machine weights, as they learn the movement. Once they become comfortable with performing the movement, they can then progress to a free weight environment, dumbbell or barbell, to train in that environment. The only difference is, not only in a free weight environment do they have to exert the force, the only difference is they have to control the movement. In a machine weight environment, as mentioned, the machine controls the movement for you. All you have to do is exert the force or effort. Exercise order. What should you do first? What should you do in series? What should you leave to last? Let's look at some common rules. Compound exercises should be done first. Large muscle groups should be done first. Complex exercises first. I'll talk about that a bit later on. If possible, alternate between upper and lower body. And abdominals, or actually abdominals, lower back, trunk should be done last. Okay, let's look at these rules. Compound exercises should be done first. Why? The reason for that is compound exercises usually involve large muscle groups initially, and isolation exercises usually only involve small muscle groups. Let's look back at that example of bicep curls as an isolation exercise and a rowing movement for a compound exercise, which involves shoulder extension for the lat dorsi, latissimus dorsi, and elbow flexion for the biceps. If I did bicep curls first and fatigued my bicep muscle, an isolation exercise, and then went to this rowing exercise and started to do this rowing movement, I would find that my latissimus dorsi wouldn't be getting the best workout that it could because my biceps are in a fatigue state from the initial exercise, from the bicep curls. So my biceps are going to work as a limiting factor to successful performance of this movement. So in this example, compound movements should be performed first so we're not fatiguing the other muscles that help in these movements. Large muscles should be performed first, or large muscle group exercises be performed first. And the main ones of the body are the upper back, the chest region, and the thighs as the main muscle groups of the body, or the largest muscle groups of the body. Complex exercises first, not really relevant to the fitness industry. In strength and conditioning, a lot of athletes will have to do complex exercises such as power cleans, clean and jerks, snatches, clean pulls, all these different types of wonderful exercises that are included in your exercise software that you'll often see in Olympic training events. And Olympic weightlifting involves snatch, clean and jerk, those types of movements. These are complex movements used in athlete preparation and should be done first. But you won't have clients utilising these exercises in a fitness environment. If they do, they are done first. If not, as in most of the cases with fitness industry clients, disregard that point. And if possible, alternate upper body versus lower body. Do an upper body exercise first, followed by a lower body to ensure appropriate recovery, or as much recovery as possible between exercises in any one session. And abdominals and also lower back, which forms our trunk, should be performed last. The trunk is a postural muscle. The abdominals and lower back are postural muscles. If we fatigue these muscles, if I've got fatigued abdominals, my posture will suffer. I'll start to slump forward. And the last thing I want to do now is perform an exercise with this posture because I'm going to be putting my lower back at risk of injury. Therefore, we want to leave those to last. And the last point is supersetting. Supersetting is a concept you might hear about in a weight training environment. Very good for novices to utilise. It improves time efficiency of a workout. An example of supersetting would be you might be doing a thigh exercise over in this corner of the gym. You do one set of that thigh exercise. Instead of waiting over in that area of the gym and resting between sets until your next set of thigh exercise is due, what you do is you go to the other end of the gym or to the other equipment in the gym and perform a set of a chest exercise. After you finish that set of a chest exercise, instead of waiting around to recover, you go back and perform a set of that thigh exercise. Very good for time efficiency, very good for developing muscle endurance, and a wonderful response by novice trainers who tend to improve regardless of the training load that you impose. However, as we get more advanced in our training, recovery between efforts is more important depending on what we want to achieve, hypertrophy versus maximal strength versus endurance. So as we get more advanced, supersetting is not commonly used, but can be a great tool to introduce resistance training to a novice who doesn't have a lot of time at their hands. Okay, we're going to finish up with looking at a sample novice program. Somebody walks into the gym, and this is a very common scenario in the fitness industry. Somebody will come in and say, I want to get stronger, I want to get bigger, I want to increase the size of my muscles. How do I go about it? Let's develop a program for this person. Now, I know I've spoken quite a bit about the variables for maximal strength, the variables for hypertrophy, and that's fine, but what we find with novices and beginners is that they respond quite favourably to almost a different form of training. So what research has shown that works very well for novices or beginners who want hypertrophy, as little as 2 to 3 sets, somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 15 repetitions per exercise, and 2 to 3 minutes rest between sets. Now for a beginner who wants to increase their muscle hypertrophy, they'll respond very favourably to this. They only need to do 2 to 3 sets per exercise, 8 to 15 repetitions, 2 to 3 minutes. Now, as we mentioned before, as we progress with our training, as we develop, what we'll find is that these variables will need to be changed, and they'll need to be more reflective of the hypertrophy variables if this person wants continued increase in muscle mass. That is, their recovery will be reduced to between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, and their repetition range will stay in the 8 to 12 range, and sets could be 3 to 4. They'll increase in training volume. But initially, we'll find in the first 2 months, a novice, sorry I left out the E, a novice will respond very favourably to this training load. Okay, so let's look at some exercises for a novice. Let's look at muscle groups, might be the best way to do this. We'll start with upper back, lower back, thigh. We'll put the thigh as a cue for quadriceps, which is the front of the thigh. Thigh hamstrings, or back of the thigh. Calf, which is the lower leg. Chest. Deltoids. And abdominals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 exercises. We're going to develop a whole body workout for this novice athlete to do 3 times per week. Okay, now let's look at the rules that we should follow in exercise order. Let's look at the isolation exercises. Abdominals is generally an isolation exercise. Hamstring exercises are generally isolation. Now the reason I put thigh hamstring in there as an isolation exercise is because most of the compound movements, or most of the compound exercises in a gym environment for the thigh muscle target the quadriceps very well, but don't really give the hamstrings a really good workout. So we need to supplement our exercise program by including some exercises for the hamstring. Now most of the time, or if not exclusively, all exercises for the hamstrings are isolation or single joint. Same holds true for the calf muscle. Predominantly isolation exercises available in gyms and nothing else. And also calf muscles that do get worked in a lot of the big leg exercises that target the quadriceps, but the calf muscle doesn't get a great workout, so we need to address that as well. Abdominals, predominantly isolation, and lower back. Isolation as well. So let's put these into an exercise order. Big muscle groups first. Try to alternate upper body versus lower body, and we want to make sure we do our compound movements first. So let's start with an upper back exercise. First exercise is upper back. Next exercise, we want to alternate to a big muscle group of the lower body. So we can go to the thigh, quadriceps. Want to alternate to a major muscle of the upper body, looking at perhaps the chest. Now we could go to a lower body, we could alternate back down to a lower body. We're left with two isolation exercises, calf and hamstring, or we could stay upper body and work compound movements for the large muscles of the upper body, or the large muscle of the upper body that's left, which is the shoulder. No right or wrong answer, but I might just head with keeping with the compound movements and leaving the isolations to last. So we might go to a shoulder exercise, and we've found now that we've conducted all of our compound movements and we've only got isolation left. So let's drop down to the lower body and look at an isolation exercise now, and maybe the hamstrings would be a good time to address this muscle group. And finally, we've got calf, another isolation exercise. And I'm actually going to combine abdominals and low back as last. They're going to be put together because quite commonly in the fitness industry, when you're working with clients, the end of their program, before they do their cool down, is they'll do their abdominals and lower back work on a mat. And there's a number of abdominal exercises and lower back exercises that can be found in your exercise prescription software. Generally these are combined, they're done on the floor and they're done last because of their postural support. We don't want to fatigue them during the program. So there's our target muscle groups that we're going to work for our beginner. Total body program using these variables 3 times per week, and they will increase their muscle mass quite significantly in the first 6 to 8 weeks of this program. Upper back, any sort of rowing movement where you've got the weight away from you and you've got to pull it towards you is classified as an upper back exercise. Thigh, things like squats and leg presses are really good for that muscle group. Chest, any pressing movement where you're pushing the weight away from your body, such as laying flat on your back and doing a bench press, is a chest exercise. Shoulder, standing doing a press or seated doing a press. Remember, it's a novice, so we want to try to focus most of our attention in machine weight environments so they learn the movement. Thigh, we do leg curls or hamstring curls as an isolation exercise. Calf raises as an example for the calf. And then we jump on the mats and do abs and lower back. Now don't be too concerned at the moment if you don't know many exercises. I'm only talking muscle groups, because as part of your class in gym exercise, which involves the use of your exercise prescription software, you're going to develop a very good bank of exercises to prescribe for all of these muscle groups, and to make sure that your clients have very good exercise programs to follow that are working towards their goals that they've come to you to see you about in terms of a weight training environment. Thank you for your time and good luck with your study.